Hey y'all, this is going to be an unscripted deep dive into components in Mast. At the time of making this video, we've recently launched a few newer, more complex components like slider, tabs, interactive video, marquee, etc. And a lot of these things are all starting to really be cohesive, work together, share things, have consistency in props and strategies. And I really want to dive into some of those details, both as an overview of what's available here, some of the high level stuff you'll find in the docs, but also like really get into the weeds, into the things that you won't find in the docs around structure and strategy and some of the thinking behind each of the components. Just because we really believe in this why of Mast, and not just giving you the tools and saying, here's the options, but for you to fully understand how and why they're built the way they are so that you can use this as a foundation to extend upon and grow for any individual project you could ever need. And that's why we always say with Mast, the wonderful analogy of if you give somebody a fish, they'll eat for a day. If you teach them to fish, they will eat for a lifetime. We will repeat that over and over again because we truly want to teach you to fish with this, and this just being this really rock solid foundation you can scale for any project. So without further ado, let's jump into it. On the components page here in the Mast clonable, this is a fresh clonable, so no modifications here. Again, this is relevant at the time shooting, so if things do evolve in the future, just keep that in mind. It's probably going to be a longer video as well, so feel free to skip ahead to any of the specific components you might be wondering about at the time. Otherwise, if you're in for all of it, let's jump in. So first one here is button. Pretty straightforward on the surface. Even myself in creating this over time, really thought this would be more simpler, and there was a couple different iterations on how to go about this, but I'm stoked with where it turned out. So overall, a high level of even starting with button, but giving a broad overview of the general strategy and consistency you'll find across all components in Mast is props in the way that they are organized, named. We try to use the descriptions as much as we can, and then really be strategic about what props we use when to optimize not just for the developer experience, but also for page performance, simplicity, and just overall longevity of building a site on the framework. And so overall, we have variants, simple things like primary, secondary. Remember always that Mast is very intentionally just the foundation. You aren't going to come here and find 17 variants of a button, because every single design system, especially that I've personally built and worked in the last 12 plus years building websites, is always vastly different. There's some that have literally one button pattern, or I've worked on some that have 12, it's all over the spectrum. So this is just a foundation for you to start from and have a very clear path to move forward and iterate on once you get going. So you could definitely add many other variants here: tertiary, small primary, small secondary, small tertiary, etc., and so on. Other things to note is this, uses icons that you can have on the left or right, and it's using the icon component under the hood. So there's consistency there if you ever iterate on that or use a different icon library or anything like that. It's all interconnected. And we have some just basic defaults that are common, like play on the left, arrow on the right kind of thing, but you can adjust those, see the docs for the icons on specific ones to use. And then you'll notice that there's an advanced group pretty consistently in almost every single component in Mast. And the underlying thing here is while, yes, building in a component-first way in Webflow greatly benefits the marketer, the client, the collaborator, the less technical person that is going to help maintain the site and doesn't need to necessarily learn the complexities of HTML and CSS and classes and all those things. And so any of that type of stuff that is very, very useful for us as developers to make small modifications like inline styling or adding attributes for targeting or custom code, any of that stuff we're always going to put into the advanced group. So maybe one day, hopefully in Webflow, we can even conditionally set groups to close by default for anybody so that ideally you just have a lot cleaner view. Because we also really think about the hierarchy and legibility of props in each component. We don't want to overcomplicate them and make it really hard to understand, especially at a first pass, and also make it efficient to find things when you're working really quickly, right? So that's just a high level note. You'll always find this advanced stuff here. And beyond the basics of that, the one thing I want to call about advanced for buttons specifically that could be a little confusing for some is some of the props here for like link visibility, text visibility, and some of these. And so a high level one I would say for most of these is for making the button usable in other places that's not essentially just a link or an A element in HTML. As with these basic examples, we also want to use it as a literal button HTML element for places like forms, and then be able to add the type submit attributes so that it works as a submit button in a form, as well as down here in like the modal. This needs to also be a literal button element. You can see if we go in and edit the modal component, here's our button and it is set as a button, right? Or in other places, the button is being used for like arrows here. Again, needs to be a literal button component. And also say something else that we really took care with is, again, making sure that things are as performant and clean as possible in the end rendered page, not just only optimizing for developer experience. And so this is one of those, right? And so you can see even with this example down here, in order to convert this to a button, we're doing a few different things. We're going to hide the link visibility, which is just an overlay link we can show in just a sec. And then we're going to change the tag from the default A to a, actually, I think it's a div by default because we have the overlay, to a button. And then we're going to do the text aria as false because that's normally set on the visible text so that a screen reader will read out the text that is stashed in the link overlay. So it'll say link and then, label, whatever that is. And so we want to inverse that here. One way to see this too is just publishing the page, seeing it live. And you'll notice how the buttons are still quite clean, especially to some other frameworks and approaches out there that I've seen. And so you can see the standard button as a link is a div, and then here's this link overlay in there with the SR only hidden, and readable text, and then the aria hidden on the visible text, again, for screen reader purposes. But overall, still a pretty simple structure. And then if we come down here to the same component as the button, it is literally just a button, with the text only inside. And we, again, strategically use the visibility props instead of custom CSS or anything to hide and show stuff, because if you aren't aware, visibility props in Webflow are server side. So in other words, when something is set to visibly hidden, as it is on this button, that means that that element is fully removed and does not render in the HTML, again, keeping things clean and simple. So yeah, overall, I think that's it for the buttons. The text here is literally just showing what text links look like. If you wanted a text version of a button, you would just add another variant for that in your design system. Again, we don't do that out of the box on purpose because not every design system would need that. Moving on, forms. Forms are an interesting one because, as you'll notice, they're intentionally not literal components in Webflow. They are static elements. The primary reason of this is intentional, and that is from the belief and experience over the years of building sites that the vast majority of times a form needs to be created, it's best done by a developer like you or I, versus necessarily a marketer or somebody like that, because more often than not, especially for business context, the form isn't just the form. It needs to be hooked up to something and send submissions somewhere special outside of Webflow, and may occasionally need special input types like uploads or sliders or something else. And so we just find it best to really keep these simple. And ultimately, when you componentize a form in your final site, each instance of a form would itself be the global component, right? So like this might be the contact form and I can just create a component and call it contact form, or I might have a separate one that is the sales form and all that will be its own component. And the control, the global control across those is still going to be held with things like styling through the use of classes. And overall, yeah, there's still plenty of consistency there. If you ever want to, you could, of course, absolutely go to the extent of componentizing these. If you also have strong opinions that they should be fully components built with custom elements and all that, let us know. We're always happy to hear that feedback, and if we hear enough, could shift the direction. So, only other thing I'd say on forms is, the nested label style is just an opinionated aesthetic that we really like. works in a lot of cases, but I will absolutely say there's some cases where you might have forms that have really long labels or other text that you want around the label that makes this not as good of a style. So I was also just going to quickly show what this looks like to unstyle it, if you will. So let me pop that over. It's really simple overall. So the main thing we'd want to do is go on the input. Let's set the top padding back to something normal, and then remove all of the absolute and set this back to relative. And then on the label, let's remove this left margin, that top, maybe bump this up to 0.5. And then let's go over here to the input group and then just ditch all these little paddings. And you can see already we're pretty much back to what it needs to be. And then I forget on the select, I believe this arrow is something that is stashed in some CSS for the forms component up here. While we're here, this is also a great note on just how components are handled in Webflow. So this styling is all right here. It should be top 50%. I won't, for the sake of the video, I won't mess with this now. But yeah, you should just have to adjust this one right here. That arrow is just built, visually with two borders. And so you should just be able to adjust that position, through manipulating something like this. What's a little confusing though is that why the 50%, is not 50%. Like it seems odd that you would do something like this. So I will look into this, but again, that would be the general approach. And so while we're here, another opinionated approach that is again tried and tested through many projects over the years is how custom code is handled for components. Because while we always also try to make as much of the framework built natively as possible in Webflow, so that it naturally evolves with the product. It's also oftentimes a lot easier to learn because there's additional resources that Webflow provides and help docs and videos and all that about how to use Webflow that this will naturally align with, because we try to, again, keep things as native as possible. That's honestly, in a lot of ways, another reason we like to keep this static, is that in order to fully componentize forms, you would need to rebuild all these as custom elements, which is fine and works, but it definitely starts to thwart away from native capabilities like, a select, having the nice UI here and all that. This was one I forgot to update was, if for the text area, we would just throw a CC, text area on these and then move that 9rem here nor there. And so, yeah, the one thing I was going to say though is, as we're in here with any components, the global custom code component, is just as the name implies. This is where literally all of the CSS and JavaScript that you should need in a project should go. There is maybe small exceptions of things like, tracking scripts or things like that you might still want to put in project settings head, or there could be some other small things you might want to put in project settings body, or even the case where you want something that's truly code only for a single page. So sweet, put that in the page settings or in its own component on the page. But otherwise, the broad lens of all these are stashed here. And so for all of our components, you can see there's just a custom labeled div for all of these. And within it is an embed for the CSS and JS if it's required. And then in most cases for things like these bottom ones here, the JS is actually just an externally hosted file on our GitHub repo. So if you're ever wanting to modify that, you can totally, in a very, very simple way, grab that URL, remove the min, and then there's your code. You could copy paste this, put it in your own repo, or even just paste it straight raw back in here. The one thing you'd want to make sure to do though is ensure that any of this doesn't load till after, with like updating this to like a document ready function, since it's all loaded up here near the top of the page. Otherwise, all of these scripts are set to defer. so they will load properly after all the HTML. And then the other high-level thing to note is any of these externally hosted scripts are also strategically written, so they have what's called an early exit. As you'll see at the top of a lot of these, the main point is that we know that there's likely pages that won't have all of these components, and we want to be absolutely sure that there's no negative performance impact from having these still present on the page. And so this is only doing a very brief network call and then immediately exit, does not execute the rest of this code. So you can be sure that it will not impact page performance. Another big reason we put these up here versus others that may, like I've seen, mental models around putting any custom code in the literal component, is that model is, for me, concerning, simply because if you have numerous instances of that component on the page, you're bloating the HTML. Even if that JavaScript is only executed on the first one, you still are replicating it multiple times, and that is just extending the length of the HTML further and further and further. And in a world where SEO is still valid, but we have things like AEO and AI now trying to understand our sites, we need to still lean into keeping them as clean and simple to read as possible and not mucked up with extra custom code that just simply doesn't need to be there. So sorry, again, unfiltered, unscripted rant. But yeah, that's just some of the shape around custom code use with components in Webflow. The other thing I was going to say is we do also have a GitHub where if you are familiar with using GitHub, you could also come out here and go ahead and fork this if you wanted to, and have it on your own repo. This is also handy too if you wanted to download all these and then provide them to your client so that they can host them themselves if they want them on their own CDN instead of just like free JS deliver. So anyways, end rant there on custom code, but just know that these are all here. And sorry, actually, no, not end rant. The last thing I would say is if you really want to go to the ultimate extreme of optimized page performance and absolutely eliminate every possibility, the other really interesting reason that we organize them this way is what you could also do, though we don't feel this is necessarily critical out of the box, which is why we don't do it. But if you wanted to, you could hook up visibility props to each of these folders. Or maybe a good way to think about this is as you in your own project have maybe a really specific custom component that is really code heavy or something like that, but you only want to load it on a couple pages, you could still stash the code in here, hook up a visibility prop, and then just either have it hidden by default and then optionally turn them on when you know that that component, its HTML is on the page, then turn it on so it'll render. Because as we said earlier, what's the beauty of visibility props in Webflow is they're server side. So you can optionally completely not render any of that custom code here if it's not needed. So just want to make that last note there. Let's keep moving. Again, it's going to be a long video. Hang in there. Okay, next one, Accordion. Accordion, definitely a simple one on the surface. We have props to adjust things like, text, the class used, right? If you want to bump that up or down, you can do that. And then going into the settings, settings is another common term you'll see in prop groups. It's just a broad one that we found is useful to just like, have this consistent pattern, kind of like consistently seeing the advanced group. You'll often see settings. And so this one has things like open in the designer, just for visual reference, if you prefer, I forget already. Do we just remove it? Yeah. If you just prefer it to visually look like this for whatever reason, you can do that. And then if you want to optionally have one start open on the page, then as the note implies here, you just change this to true. And then group name, again, definitely lean into the notes here. Group name means, if you had like a couple different, lists of accordions in the same area, on the same page, the same region, you can apply a name consistently here and here and here so that for screen readers, it will associate them together. And then list item, all this really means is the accordions, as I should also mention, should always, typically if there is a list like FAQs, they should be used in the list component, which is really just that. It's just a div with the, It's right here. It's a, div, or in this case, a slot with the role of list, right? And then our accordions by default, assuming that they're most oftenly used for something like an FAQ, they will have the role of list item. But if you're just using like a single accordion somewhere on its own, just go ahead and clear that. Just again, to keep things as semantically correct and accessible as possible. I haven't really said this yet, but you'll hear me mention accessibility multiple times throughout this. I'm very passionate about accessibility, and especially all the depth that comes with it. Oftentimes people paint it in the simplest ways of things like color contrast or max font size or stuff like that, but there's so many spectrums of accessibility, and there is no such thing as a perfectly accessible website or framework, but we really do our best to lean into making things as modern, accessible, performant as possible. And so beyond the props and what's available here, some other just general things to know is that on the live page, if we go out and look at that, we of course get like a little bit of smooth animation. And so the open close here is using GSAP. And then we're just using a little CSS tacked on to the state. Let me inspect that. Tacked onto the state to rotate the cursor, or sorry, the plus. And so if you wanted to adjust that, again, you would just come up here and go into our custom code, accordion. Here you can find the CSS for that icon rotate, or if you want the JS, it's again in this external file that you could come out here and modify if you want to. Otherwise, again, we just find that this is like pretty straightforward and simple. So it's fairly simple. One thing to note too is with it using GSAP, there's some small things in here that like maybe one day we can, when IX3 is fully capable, we can move it in to be, again, we always try to be as native as possible, but just note that, this is one of those components, that is why, GSAP is turned on by default in Mast. Even soon we'll have more, baked in animation functionality that all will use IX3, the latest, interactions with GSAP in Webflow, which is of course GSAP based. So, last thing I'll say on the accordion is structure. So this is using the more modern details and summary HTML elements here. Main point here is just it comes with some free functionality around declaring things being open, closed, that kind of stuff, and it's just overall the more modern, accessible way to build something like an accordion. And so I think that's it on those. Moving on. Modal. So Modal is similar to the accordion in the way that, while we're on the topic of HTML elements, it uses the more modern dialogue HTML element so that we get some free functionality from HTML that is still widely supported in browsers. Some of that functionality is things like, hitting, escape to close, as well as trapping your focus and auto focusing. You can see that after I go in here, it immediately focuses on the close button there, which is maybe even a tiny bug. Like, shouldn't that be the brand primary color? Interesting. And so if you have buttons in here and other things in the modal, it will trap that focus too, which is proper for accessibility. Pretty straightforward. Otherwise, as far as attributes go, the button is just the button component. So we pull through things like the variant, text, visibility. For example, visibility is one that you might want to just use this modal as a pop-up, naturally. So you could hide the button and then, you can change this attribute down here to open and load to true. So it would do just that. And then it also has baked in cooldown days. So again, for the case of, using it as a pop-up, not that I would necessarily recommend pop-ups on websites, but I know that they are a common request. So you can set this to number of days. What this means, as the note implies, that once you have, this only works when you have this set on true, but when this is set on true, it will pop up on page load. And if a user closes it and you have this as something other than 0, then it will be that many days before it then pops up again, or it will remember the fact that they close it. So say you set this to 1, the user opens the page, they're like, get out of here, pop up, they close it, and then they refresh the page or go around and come back. They will not see that pop up again for 24 hours or one day. So, just make note of that. The preview modal here is just latching on to the natural open attribute. And so we can just like add any value in there, and then that will show you it. This is really handy. So then you can go ahead and add, a button, or whatever else you need to in here to format the content of your modal. So pretty straightforward there. Attribute name and value we also pulled through from the button. This is helpful if you ever wanted to do a little bit of JavaScript to, like click to open the modal on page load. You could use an attribute here to target that, data, modal, open, I don't know, whatever you want. Also useful for things like if you're using custom event tracking, you might need to pull through certain attributes there. And I think that's it. Moving on. Slider. So slider is a fun one, always a high demand one. Also one that I've, always struggled with in terms of, I personally enjoy a slider. I think it's a great way to condense content and be lightly interactive. But there's, a whole other spectrum of to consider with sliders around things like accessibility. It's really actually tricky to make them accessible. And I don't know that it's necessarily ideal to ever make them fully accessible or possible. So yeah, something to always consider there. The bones of this slider are Swiper.js. Very common, especially in the Webflow community, but, I would say even globally, really, really common, really capable, slider library, with all kinds of functionality, and probably, hopefully no surprise at this point, we only give what we feel is the most common possible, options and things that you might want to do with the slider, but you could always extend that if you want to. Something I haven't mentioned yet in the video is we also live in a time now where there's things like AI. So please, go use Claude. If you ever are like, hey, this slider's working great. But I really want to add, one more of these options that, Swiper offers. Like, here we go. If you go to demos in here, this does some just gnarly stuff. Look you can do like a cube, and, cover flow, all kinds of stuff. We don't feel these are as common, but again, know that you could add these things if you want to. And the workflow to do it would be, again, let's come out and go to our custom code component and the JS here. So here's where we're loading in the Swiper library. And then here's our external JS file. So again, if I was going to go get this, remove that min, I could copy paste this into Claude and say, hey, Claude, I'm using Swiper.js in this. I want to add an option for the cube effect. Can you do that? And then maybe, it either does it by default if you want that everywhere, or you could be a little more clever as well with updating the slider component to tie that to an attribute. So if you go under the hood of the slider, we do definitely have to get strategic about what attributes are held where, simply because of, the structure, what can be set in certain places and all that. So you see that the vast majority of the options are set on the Swiper element here. And so you could always add another one here that is like data. I guess we already have the effect here. And actually, now that I say this, could we do that? So again, you could add any other attribute, target that, talk to Claude about it. Now that I said that though, I was like, wait, I think we only support certain effects out of the box. Yeah. Slide or fade are the only ones we built in for now. So in a lot of ways, actually, now that I say that, if you wanted this exact scenario we were, hypothetically discussing, you could just still update the JavaScript, to support whatever the effect is you want, like cube, and then just say, hey, Claude, it should work when the effect attribute has the value of cube. And in this case, to be more specific, it wouldn't just be the effect attribute. Go in and see what it's set on right here, options. So it'd be the data-effect attribute, right? So anyways, just noting that as what you can do. And if it wasn't clear before too, again, we just find it handy to externally host these and have some version control. You could totally just dump that code right back in here. Again, just make sure that Claude knows it's near the top of the body, and, to add a document ready and make sure that it runs when it should. The other just general benefit I didn't mention earlier too about doing the external script is if we find any small bugs, we can update those. And if anybody has consumed Mast, we can, this is set to latest, so it'll always get the latest version of the file once it's, cache is purged and all that. So anyways, that's there. If we jump into some of the other props and things here, slides per breakpoint and gap. First of all, huge shout out to Timothy Ricks and the Lumos framework and this approach to using CSS variables to dynamically set the number of slides that you can adjust and see it both visually in the canvas and have it run on the page. 100% inspired by him and his approach here. Very, very smart. As we only have so many ways to pull through components, hopefully more component prop types are coming in the future, but I found this one very, very clever. And so, yeah, you can set these to any number, even decimals and things. And then this is per breakpoint, as you'll find with the layout system and anything else in Webflow. We really lean into the native breakpoints. And so you can adjust that at each one. And again, visually see that here. So if we're like, that's a little too tight, let's do 2 here and then look at it here. And maybe we'll do 1.5 here, and so on and so forth, and then down to 1, right? So you can get that quick preview of accuracy in here, for most things and make that adjustment. Another one here is on the gap. This is using a variable, right? So ideally we would always recommend using variables. And so, it's using these here. Actually I think it's gap main is the one that it has, but if you wanted to do like gap small, you can do copy CSS there. Oh, it looks like it was using gap medium. And so I could drop that in there. You see the gap change in between the cards. You could also set this to a raw value, 60 pixels or something wild, right? So just make sure you keep this, the variable declaration there, for that to work. Nav position, top, center, are other options here. Again, you could always update these variants if you wanted something else, like the arrows on one corner, paired together or anything like that. Again, this is just a common starting point. Previous buttons, again, these are using actual, the button component. They just are set again, as we showed earlier, as a button, and then using specific attributes that the custom JavaScript is targeting. So make sure to not alter those to retain the functionality. And then this is also using the text visibility. So we're, removing that text entirely here. But we are still setting it so that text is still in the button. And so, then we're using the icons that's already in there to set the arrow left and right. So again, very good and solid and reusable. As you've probably seen so far, if you've made it this far, is something else to just note along this is we really lean into also reusability of components, because we know that at scale in Webflow, if you do get like hundreds of components in here, it can impact the designer editing experience in Webflow, not necessarily the live site, as long as you have things like per page CSS and JS turned on, but it can harm the experience in here. So we try to really reuse these things as much as possible for that, but also just because this way, the more you reuse things, the less places you have to go update them when you want to update them, right? So once you update the button once, you'll see those updates reflected anywhere else buttons are used, right? Other settings here, progress visibility, right? So that's the pagination dots there in the middle. And then, just go through all the different, props here and, adjust turning overflow on or off, grab cursor if you want things centered when they start rendering. I think this one's only on the live page, not in the designer. If you want things to loop or not, loop additional slides is like if you are looping and you want to make sure to not see like an empty spot before it starts looping again, you can increase this number to 2, for example, if you only had like, 5 slides or something, and that will help with that. And then as with any, you'll see the advanced props. So, other thing to note on the slider is, this was one reason we ended up adding a collection list out of the box in here, was to show how this is used with a CMS collection, because that is such a common use case for sliders. And so in general, it's pretty straightforward. You just need a collection list in here. And I'm trying to remember if there's any attributes. I don't think so, no. So yeah, the collection list, no styles, classes, special things needed here. You just add a collection list, connect it to what you want to, filter, sort, do all the things you normally would, and then throw in your component, or technically it wouldn't even need to be a component since this whole thing is a component, but put in your content, bind things up, and then from there, just include, or you obviously have to create a component out of that collection list as you saw, and then just throw that right in the slider. And then the one bit of thing the JavaScript's doing here is removing a couple layers of the collection list and wrapper to clean that up and have the structure be what it needs to be in its final form. And so in general, you can go see these here. Again, just wanted to clarify, I'm just stoked with how this turned out in the way of, again, cleanliness. The structure is all pretty much as it would be statically. You should be able to freely unlink these components, or the slider component if you need to. And since all the structure is pretty vanilla for the most part, it all should still work as expected. And overall, just I've found those kinds of things really help with, if you ever have customization that's needed or any of that, there's just such a lower learning curve to understand how it's currently working before you can get to the point of customizing it. So yeah, I think that's it for slider. Let's move on. Inline video. So the point of this one is to be kind of like a background video element in Webflow, right? But if you've used this component, you know maybe that when you upload a video to it, it just destroys the quality of it, and you can't really control that quality in any way. It does have play pause and some other benefits, and it hosts the video for you, which is really nice. But overall, it can just be a tricky one. And I don't believe you can fully prop everything up to that in terms of being a component. So instead, what we do here with the inline video component is we literally build it out as a HTML video element, right? Again, accessibility and performance and leaning into all the things the web offers out of the box. And so in here, some other things to note, we have a separate poster element that is intentionally used just for, again, accessibility and also performance reasons, making sure that we're not getting any flags for CLS or images that aren't properly loaded or fetched. And so we have that there. Also, the poster as an image makes it really handy because then you can just like select it like any other image. And then for the video itself, you do need to host this video somewhere. So again, if you don't have an option for that, you could even do the workaround where you add the native background video element, upload your video to that, and then once it's done, I think you need to publish maybe or inspect in the designer to get the URL. This is actually one of those types of URLs. So that's why this video is slightly grainy. And also off aspect ratio because it was shot slightly differently or recorded slightly differently from that. But the point is that you can also host these a lot of places, Vimeo, Bunny CDN, all that kind of stuff. You can also alter the type here if you're using something like WebM or something different. Playback. So yeah, we do have a native play pause button. If you don't want that, you can hide that, but I would recommend it just again from an accessibility perspective, allowing somebody to, tab in and play pause that, as well as doing things like automatically pausing it. If there is prefers reduced motion on, we will do that automatically for you. There is some settings with this as well. So for example, if the video is heavier, like I would recommend over a megabyte or two, then I would probably turn the setting to true. So that way the video only plays on desktop where people usually have better bandwidth and connection speeds. But then on mobile, it will simply, if this is set to true, it will simply not autoplay the video and show the poster only for then optimized performance. Because the other thing to note about this component is that this video is being lazy loaded. So it is not actually loading that video until it scrolls into view. So if you have this component further down the page and the video is massive, like 10 megabytes or something, though I wouldn't recommend that either way, it will not impact your initial paint performance of the page. So yeah, really, really critical there. You can also toggle on and off the scroll into view, as well as toggle on a play on hover. This one, shout out to my time at Webflow. It's inspiration from actually on the homepage there. We use a similar component in this slider. So when you hover, it's playing the video. So you could do something similar with this mask component as well. To that point too, as you saw, the aspect ratio is different. We have a preset style in the advanced tab in this case. So if you wanted to change this to, 7:9 or whatever, you could do that. Yeah, you can adjust that there. And I think that's it for the video. As you expect, any custom code that is running this is out here, right here. So we don't actually have any CSS with this. All the CSS is native in the designer. Yeah, I think that's it. Moving on, Marquee. So this is a pure CSS driven Marquee. Let's hop back right over into here. Just so we can see that I'm not a liar. And here's all the CSS for that. The simple CSS animations there, and then just some other small styling things like using mask image for the masked faded out edges on either the horizontal or vertical variants. To that point, you will see that there is both vertical and horizontal variants. Some other really important things to remember about the Marquee is that there is 2 slots. And so, since this is a looping type of component, we want to make sure that the same exact items in the first slot are replicated in the second slot. And while it won't fully break, if that's not the case, that is the magic of how the looping works. Essentially meaning that, we're just animating one of these groups from 0 to 100%. So by the time the end of that gets here, you can see right here, here's the end of this first group. So here's the second group that we want to see coming in. And then as soon as it crosses through there, it's an illusion that it's actually resetting and going over again. So, just note that in terms of how it works. In general, the more items, the merrier. To this point too, as far as items, we are really always trying to lean into things being as absolutely flexible as possible. And so, in this case, you'll just see I have a card component. This is just a placeholder. You could throw, an image in here. You could throw some logos in here using the image, component, any of that kind of stuff. And then in this case with the, sorry if I can get selected on one of these, the card, we're just setting a specific min width, with the inline style to be able to find that, but you could definitely do it in a lot of other clever ways with maybe a reusable class or whatever you want to there. As far as other props to check out, we have things like you can adjust the duration, you can reverse the animation if you want it to go the other way. And what's wild is a lot of this is also, you saw it's not that much CSS to do this, which is pretty fun. Gap, again, in this case, we set actually a fixed gap. You could, just to make it a little more simple, but you could 100% use the same, variables that we did before, right? There's our small, here is our medium, right? So you can do that kind of thing as well for even more consistency. And then, advanced is all pretty straightforward. And then as you already saw, there is the variable, the variant for orientation between horizontal and vertical. You could also even extend this further if you wanted to. Like something I've thought about after the fact is, there could be a case where you want something to be like vertical on desktop and then horizontal on tablet. So, you should be able to create another variant to do that. And then you may just need to, slightly adjust the CSS that's used in here. Again, your AI is your friend. Shout out Claude. You may just need to come in here and adjust that. You'll see that we have a couple lines here. These ones are for the mask, but then we have a couple lines here that are specifically for this attribute for the vertical variant. And so if you had something else there, you might want to adjust, the scroll direction. In this case, which is just it's just a different animation, right? You see scroll left, right, up, down. So just toggling between those basically. Otherwise, in terms of the, layout, the only other change in that variant, as we will see, if I go over here to the vertical, is flex, right? So all we're doing is just horizontal is, is one way. Oh, wait, it's actually down here. Horizontal is horizontal. Vertical is going to flip to be vertical, right? So pretty straightforward. So yeah, I think that's it for the marquee. Let's keep it moving. Tabs. Oh, I'm so excited about how tabs turned out. So the high level thing on tabs here is we're really balancing back and forth between how to keep this as absolutely flexible as possible. But then at the same time, not again have too many components. We're really trying to be cognizant of having too many components. And I think there's maybe even still small areas of possible reusability. Even things like you can see we have another play pause button here. Maybe that should be also just the button and not its own thing here. Maybe updates to come. We'll see. Either way, in the meantime, the general structure here is we have the main tabs wrapper component. This is literally just a slot. The only key here is in this case, the class that is used and needs to be the wrapper for all the tabs and the functionality to work. And then in that, in this case, you can see that this is a structure. Maybe something else I should have mentioned earlier on is that another belief we have with Mast, and this is again kind of from experience of building projects, is that we find that, especially if you've seen like some of Timothy Rick's content around open versus closed components, or if not, we lean in mostly to most components being in that phrase open, right? And that the idea is the marketer, the non-technical collaborator, their best workflow to build a page or modify a page is from copy pasting or adjusting things in the canvas. We don't feel that the best experience is to rely on finding something in this panel and dragging it in, for many reasons. The preview, look at that, is not great. It also really limits you to needing to then again go nuts with this having way too many components in here. And it usually then also limits the amount of flexibility, right? And so I think tabs is such a good example of this because here we're actually layering the tabs menu and the panes into the row and column system that's used everywhere else in Mast. And so the beauty of that is so that we can then do an example like this. That's literally the exact same structure. But all we're doing is just setting a specific column width on each of these columns. And, you know, we could play with, alignment on the row, right? And yet the structure and functionality remains the same. So really, really excited about that. The other benefit here too is like if you wanted to add other content around your tabs, right? Again, this is definitely something I've experienced semi-often. Even, you know, webflow.com has a few examples of this where, you know, maybe we want a little heading here and then a button because we got to have a CTA, and then you know, we want our tabs after that. And then maybe this one's like a little larger. And then actually, no, we do need that other spacer down here for our autoplay. Maybe we'll just do small. It's too small. Let's do medium. And so, boom, now we can have this simple little structure, fully responsive. If I decided, you know what, that's getting too tight there, I can just bump this up. And then that will just naturally flow. So very, very, very flexible. You know, it's, something I think that will work really well in the long run. Maybe if I even wanted to do center between here, and then even just go ahead and publish that to make the point that the way that you can layer and mix these things around is pretty useful, and something I'm excited to see people start to scale across different projects. So yeah, here you can see our tabs. They're all over here. Imagine you had like, you know, bigger images or something here. And again, this is all functional. So, looking at the tabs more, another really key detail here is they do have a lot of settings, but instead of them being on this outer tab wrapper, really a lot of the settings are tied to the group of links or the menu. So this is where you would go to adjust those things. So look for the tabs menu. This is where you're going to find most of the options in terms of things like adjusting the alignment to vertical or horizontal. Another solid use case I could see here too as well is using variants to do different styles of tabs. You could even do it both on the menu and then add variants to the link. So you could have like a pill style that's like out onto one side, or the full width style like this. So variants could be really powerful in this use case. Going back up to the menu, you can toggle on and off autoplay. Mobile menu dropdown is a rad one. Again, just from experience, something I've found is that, especially in cases where you want like multiple elements in here, which is something else to touch on, then that can just get really complex on mobile, right? Or even confusing. There can be this experience of like, this where, if the content's too big here, you're like scrolling up and down to switch between tabs if they aren't auto playing and then back down. And so sometimes there's even a better experience here of having these, this drop down that the tabs convert into, naturally. And so, excited about that functionality. Something to note on this as well when doing that, there is on the tab link, there's this tab label. And so this label is not the visible label you will see here. You can see I can say example 1 here instead of tab 1. This label is both the ARIA label on the tab button that's overlaid on it, as well as the label that is shown in that drop down. Specifically sorry, let me just show that again. Specifically, the label that's shown here, you can see the active tab text is always in the button of the dropdown. And so that is what's shown there. We intentionally simplify it to just text. You could modify this if you wanted to show an icon or something there, just be a little trickier. And again, not always needed. So we simplified. That is the text that will show there. So just note that. And then anything that's in here is just going to be what's in your tab menu. In fact, if I go to inspired layouts, is a good example that on our inspired layouts page, if you scroll down here, you can see we have a tab section here and it has this icon and text in it, because if we go out to desktop, it has icon and text. And so that's a great transition into one other rad part about these tabs. Unlike others I've seen out there, is that you can put whatever you want, including multiple elements in the tab link. So that might not be as common for something up here other than an icon. But down here, I've firsthand had this numerous times where, hey, I want a heading, and right, we have a H. This would probably actually be an H2, if this was in a normal section. And so this would need to be H3. Maybe I want to bump it down to H4 or 5. And then I want a little, rich text under there. And then the real challenging kicker that was like part of, okay, how can we solve this, that I've run into in the past, is then, also wanting to have a link in here is like, well, what about a tab? But then, we gotta bake in those CTAs. And so, maybe the button's too much. Maybe it would just be like a text link here to, google.com. And what's really cool is then these will still work, right? Because you probably would need to make sure that has a Z index or whatever, but, these will still work because the button is just an overlay. And so it's still accessible, and functional, but you can actually nest links in the tab, items if you want to. So super powerful, to note there. Let's go back to the menu. I think that's everything else. That's, pretty straightforward. You can change the autoplay duration, pretty straightforward. Pause on hover, also pretty straightforward. And I think that's it. So that does it for the interactive components. Oh my goodness, 50 some minutes. I'll maybe do a quick once over here on the content components because I think, these are much, much more straightforward. So let's do it. Jumping through breadcrumbs, this first one, this is again in that realm of it is not actually a component. And in this case, although this would be very easy to turn into a component. So if you had a site that had numerous instances of breadcrumbs and that felt necessary, do it. Like, why not? You could add visibility props to each level here. If we look at the structure, it is a proper list. And then this also has, a step further to make, the breadcrumb, properly read by, search engines with schema. We actually have these little meta elements in here that denote the level for each one. Shout out to Mike Berkey, who was on the team with me at Webflow and found this solution back then. Super, super clever and makes this really, really versatile. And so all this to say, I've found that in most projects I work on, it's rare to need breadcrumbs on more than a couple pages. And so it's usually best and fine to just keep them static like this. It's also not something you would very often need to globally update. It's not like it, is very prone. It's much more just a, secondary background type of, UI. And so we leave them static. Again, componentize them if you want to, but that's kind of the reason why. Otherwise, that is the structure. It's also a nav element as a wrapper, again, to be semantically correct. And yeah, I think that's it. Maybe noting the combo class of current page used here to reduce that. You may also have a time where you want to throw on, truncation or something on that. But yeah, that's overall it. Eyebrow, also very straightforward, right? We have things like, alignment, left and right. When this is in a column, that will actually like visually center it. And setting the text, of course, and then you could just throw on advanced stuff if you want to do anything there. Otherwise, I think the structure is, pretty straightforward. Icon. A couple things to note about icon. Icon is one of the few instances where we are nesting components not in a slot. And in this case, we're doing this strategically to be able to make use of two different levels of variance. Shout out to James Levine at Outseta. This was his feedback, somebody that uses Mast and had come up with this very clever approach for handling icons, that I was like, oh my gosh, yes, we're for sure using this. So this icon size component that you will see in the component panel, is with the others down here in the nested group. So this is something I should have mentioned earlier on too, is that nested means, as the name implies, all of these components are really only intended to be used within the nesting of another component. So rarely would you ever use these components without putting them in what they're intended to be as their parent. In most cases, you can check out the description of those to understand where they're supposed to be used, but we would hope that the name itself will be a good indicator of that. Like grid column goes in the grid row, card body goes in card, icon size goes in icon, etc. And so that's what we're doing here. Otherwise, nothing too wild as far as setup here, beyond, the fact that this is, out of the box intended to be used with a CSS based icon library. And, out of the box, the one we are using is called Phosphor. And so you can go see that, oh, sorry, was drawn a blank. Right here, the icons component, and then we have icon CSS, and you can see it's just the Phosphor CSS library. So the way this works, if you aren't familiar, if I went to phosphoricons.com, this would also work for other ones you may have heard of, like Font Awesome. I think it's just .com. I haven't been to Font Awesome in a long, long time, and I cannot type. Font Awesome. Massive, and very long time icon library, but Phosphor's free and also huge. 9,000 icons. And so the general idea of how this works is both that it's pretty performant, and very user friendly in terms of, editing icons, right? So you have an icon here and we just use classes to denote them. So, I really like cars. So if I search for car, and then find this here. Really, the name you want is right here, but just to be extra clear, if you go to the web tab, you can see here is our classes that we need. And so I would just come back here and update that. And boom, there's our car. And so super, super powerful. I do realize that there are times where you might have a smaller design system that doesn't have a pre-baked icon library like this, or is a fully custom icon library. And in those cases, your options are either, build it as a CSS file. I would again say that AI could probably help you do that. Otherwise, there's definitely other ways you could go about modifying this. For example, if you went into the icon level here, you could add SVGs here, and either use like visibility to hide and show them, or maybe some CSS to hide and show them, and still retain this idea though of having the size variant and the upper level variant, which in this case ties to color as needed. The other general thing to note here is of the sizes. We set these sizes that you can adjust in the variant, but 1M is, I would recommend one to keep. And the really nice thing about that one is being M, it matches font size. So, if you ever threw it in something like a div that is intended to have H1 with an icon next to it, it will just soak up that same font size. And so it's very, very versatile for use in things like that, or buttons or anything else. So, that's the icons component. Image component. This one is also quite versatile, and oftentimes, as I've seen people already using it, or even using it myself in real projects, is one that is often overlooked. I think one of the best ways to see how versatile this is to go look at the inspired layouts page, because we even use it for variants like background, where is essentially just absolutely full and can fill up a card or a section or something like that. Otherwise, out of the box, there's a pre-built few different common aspect ratios, or if you set it to something like custom aspect ratio, then you can just set that in the inline style right there. So pretty nice to do that. I would say one specific thing with this too is that in order to avoid what I mentioned earlier, CLS or content layout shift errors in Google Lighthouse, or from an SEO perspective, anytime you add an image, instead of letting it just like inherit the natural size of the image, ideally we always just, if that's the effect you want, just instead set an aspect ratio. So in this case, for this image even, I could just set this at 2000 by 1333, right? And so then that would operate in the exact same way as just like straight up throwing an image in here like that, and then tying to, where's my image, right? Then, this is just like a natural image that as things scale, it just scales down. This is going to function the exact same way, but have the benefit of not being affected by CLS errors, which all that means is just that, if you, as images are naturally set to lazy load, when they're scrolling in, Google doesn't want to see the page like all of a sudden loading those in and then like jumping the page height, again, for accessibility reasons. So yeah, that's there. And I think that is it for image component. We can also, this is a good one too. You'll see in advance, there's a couple other things too. If you want to adjust the loading from the default lazy, you can do that there. You can also set fetch priority here as well. Moving on, card. A card is one of the most fundamental parts of any web design, in my opinion. There is so many ways to use a card that I think, again, oftentimes are overlooked on the surface. Maybe even simple examples, especially with Mast, is wrapping things to give it a card effect. Something you might notice is that the inline video up here is actually tossed into a card. So part of that purpose is we don't want any border or anything on the inline video, because that way you could throw it as the background of a section or something if you wanted to. But in this case, I just thought it looked nicer in the card, right? So you can wrap something in a card to give it the rounded corners and the border, or whatever your card aesthetic is. Maybe it has a shadow, I don't know. And then within that, we have a separate component called card body. This also structure is one that, in my opinion, is just very obvious in a lot of ways, but it's also comes from Bootstrap CSS, just like the row and column system in Mast does. Both of those are very inspired by that kind of tried and true structure that I've found very, very versatile over the years. And so by separating these things, we can do a variety of things with just the same two components. And that's why we show this 3-column layout here, because we can do things like this. If you want the image to full bleed at the top of the card, you don't need a separate variant. You don't need a whole separate component. You can just get creative with how you structure your card and just move things around to have a lot of flexibility with this combination. Another common one that I was on the fence about, even just shipping by default, but you could very easily add if you wanted to, is different padding. I've seen this many times in design systems where, we might have a base and then we'll say like large, as another variant, and then I might just up this up, even though we have a base like card padding. I could up this to something custom like this, and I could modify it this way, or I could just be lazy and say like 4rem, just to make the point. That is a lot. Right. And then I could maybe change this back to, base is probably fine actually. Right. And so then now, in some cases I might want large. Maybe a good example here would be, if you had a, full width, card like this, right? Then you're going to want more padding. That would feel weird if it was too small and have this much space. So you could do something like that in this case and throw some rows and columns in there, and really, make, again, full CTA cards and all kinds of stuff. So that's the general structure there. Other things to note about the card is, we use the higher level card as a variant in this case for, whether or not it's hoverable. And so if I turn hover on, and preview, you can see that I get a hover effect there, right? More often than not, that hover effect would also mean that you want the link overlay visible so you could link to a page. And so that they are intentionally separate because that is also a choice. I've seen times where people don't want the card linked, but they want a hover effect just for the effect of it. I personally think the effect should indicate interaction and be linkable, but here nor there. Now you can see it's linkable. And so that's something to note, that the link is baked in. This is also, again, maybe intentionally something to call out here that another way to do this would just have a separate component that is a link overlay. And that, yes, is versatile, but again, I guess in my experience, I've found more often than not, you might want a card to be linkable, so let's just bake it in and have that global control everywhere so you don't have to remember to add the link or not in some cases or others. Note that the link overlay also you can adjust the screen reader text there that's hidden, which is really important, especially if the link on the card doesn't have a button in there like that and it's just a link card. Make sure that you update that to be relevant and better than learn more. And then target, this is just if you want the link to open a new tab. Since we can't bind to this functionality natively, we just do it via attribute here. So you just put underscore blank in order to open that in a new tab. I think that's it for card. Moving on, heading. Heading, again, pretty straightforward. It's literally just a heading element in a custom element wrapper. Nothing too special happening here. And then we're binding up, semantically the size. So you could set, it needs to be semantically an H3 in the HTML, but we want it to look like an H1. So you add the class here as a tack on. So pretty straightforward there. Another just general tip that I often use is if this is a long heading that I want to wrap specifically, that wrapping doesn't look too bad there. Some may very quickly reach for text. Wait, do we have pretty in here? I already forgot. I thought we had pretty and balance and all the things. text balance. A lot of people like text balance, right? That's fine, I think, as a blanket. And actually, that's what I was thinking of in terms of pretty, is that we have pretty applied to the whole body. So at least it tries to reduce things. Maybe I'm not remembering that way. That was a separate project. Sorry. But I personally like to do instead is throw on an inline style. and do max width of something like CH or rem, like 30 CH, that's way too small. How about 50, 60, 70, 80? Ooh, that's pretty. Right? And so again, some might be like, oh no, it's different, or better than another way. From experience, I've found being able to granularly control it like this and not just have a blanket assumption from CSS is usually superior. The main way I would say that is just because of the words, and oftentimes working with writers or people that care about those words, they want to see them wrap at a very specific point. Also, if you do use Mast for enterprise, which is really common, again, webflow.com is built on Mast, localization often comes with that. And that comes with a whole other spectrum of demands for wrapping and breaking and stuff like that of words. And so having granular control over just assumed balance, in my opinion, is better. And so this is one of those places I would say I use the inline style attribute the most. But honestly, there's a ton of things that we end up using it for in Mast. Rich text, this is pretty similar in terms of heading. Ooh, the other thing I didn't notice on heading and rich text is both can also, you adjust alignment on the element itself, not necessarily on the parent. All right, next is plain text. It's plain. It's just text. Honestly, we almost didn't even need this component. I would say where this came in was using components with CMS. It's pretty often you'll have a text field in the CMS and you cannot bind that to rich text, and we still want to make it easy to interlace collections with components, and so we needed a plain text to be able to bind that up. And so it's, as the name implies, just next. Let's look at our global components. So at a high level here, we have Nav Banner, Nav, and Footer. Nav Banner is very straightforward, just a link block with, the container and some text in there. Again, really common thing. And so just wanted to have an option there to choose from. Nav is a bit more of a thought through helpful starting place for a nav. It does use the native nav component, but then has some CSS and JavaScript integrated to add some additional functionality, as well as have a couple options for two different types of dropdowns, like a simple dropdown or a mega dropdown out of the box. That I've found both very useful. Beyond that, little CSS to toggle things, also doing stuff like on mobile, we have a custom menu icon built with divs in there that also will animate with some CSS, open and close, but don't go very far to going and overstyling things like nav links and all that. You can definitely do that to match your project. But overall, hopefully is a useful starting point. In terms of some of the functionality, sorry for jumping around. Where are we at? As well, it also has things like a baked in skip link for accessibility purposes as well. So if I go back to that inspired layouts page, for example, and tab through, you see my first tab shows up the skip to main. So it will skip down to the main, and then I can jump right into those things or, reverse back up there. So that's very helpful. We also have a JavaScript backup in there, where, the nav link, just naturally links to the ID. It does just use the main ID here, so to anchor link. So you really don't need any JavaScript to make this work. However, in case you or a collaborator doesn't or moves that ID on accident or doesn't have it, we do have some JavaScript as well to just look for the main element, which should always be set on the page main here. Look at that. Even in this example, I don't have the main ID on there. And so, that functionality is there. So very useful. Onto the footer. Footer, not really anything special going on here. It's just showing a very basic example of how to build a footer with the row and column system. Nothing unique to the footer at all. The year does have the little data attribute here for data footer year. And so there is some global JS that will target that. Again, like any custom code that is up here in this component. and global.js and right here. So we'll update that footer year. And I believe that's it. And then the last section here is going through the high-level build layout components. So we have the section, which is just a section element that you can actually adjust that tag if you want to make it an aside or anything else that you might need to for, again, accessibility reasons. And then we have our container within it and a slot. And then the section right now is hooked up to modes, which are tied to your themes. This may change soon, actually. Sorry, tied up right here. And so you can see just our different variants just toggle this theme. But we may actually adjust this to instead just have 2 themes as a base in Mast instead of the 4, just to more show the default and invert or light and dark or dark and light. And then also, show how to hook up things like a color mode switcher and all that and handle the accents a different way. Here or there, you could adjust that however you want to have different types of sections, or even go to the extent of a whole bunch of other functionality that you might want to interplay or hide and show between different variants. Otherwise, beyond that, we have our typical advanced attributes. We do use the attribute name and value open-ended here for any custom functionality that you might want to add. The next is the row and column components. Again, definitely check out like the get started video that goes through how to use all these. We're not going to cover that in this video, but as you may have seen already in some of the examples like the tabs, this is the foundation of all layout systems in Mast, both built with components where you can set, out of 4 or out of 12 columns, as well as alignment and things on the row. Or if you're building it statically, like if we hop back into the footer here, great example, right? We have a row and then columns, and we can specify how many columns at each breakpoint out of 12. And so fundamental part of Mast for sure, all built-in components here. Again, small things to note are stuff like some of the variants like shrink is really, really handy if you wanted to shrink down to like the button size, but then you could also layer in some inline styling to set a specific size if you want to. So lots of flexibility there. List, we already kind of looked at lists. This is primarily exists to be able to make sure that your accordions like FAQ groups are a proper list and accessible. But you could use this for other things too, right? You could wrap a list and throw, we even have like a component for, isn't it empty? Maybe not. You could throw other components that you're able to structure and layer in here if you wanted to. Spacer component, you saw me playing with that and some of the other ones. As the name imply, it's just to establish spacing with components. We don't necessarily subscribe to using spacer components too heavily. A lot of spacing in Mast is defined by default. So even when you saw back up here with the tabs, and I, added the little heading paragraph, and all the spacing is predefined for you. So you don't have to remember, oh yeah, I always use that one class or size under each H2. It's just all baked in to either the semantic element and the class, so they are interchangeable. And then we only use spacers in cases where we need more space or just for the sake of it being a lot easier for a marketer, non-technical person to see a spacer and adjust that versus like in this scenario, I could have also done, UMBLG on the button and thrown it down that way. Nothing wrong with that by any means. There's a lot of cases I would do this as well. It's just this is not quite as easy for a less technical collaborator to learn. Again, all the reasons we said earlier in the video, if you caught it, that that's why we put these in this advanced group. We don't want to rely heavily on modifying components solely from classes. Moving on, border is the last one here. So very, very similar to spacer. Doesn't get much more vanilla than a border as well. The one addition we add here too is variance for the amount of spacing above and below. And then you can overwrite that as well with an addition of a class. Pretty straightforward. Been a long one. If you watched this whole thing, thank you so much for lending your time and interest and to learning any of this. We're really excited about the evolution of Mast, how powerful it's become, and yet hopefully, as you've seen, how much it's still prioritizing simplicity, reusability, accessibility, and flexibility, all the abilities, all the way through the system. And again, as we've scaled it across many different cases, including Webflow.com's own quite large 200 plus static page, 10,000 CMS item site, it really performs well, and is, again, I'll keep saying it, it's just the start. This is just the foundation that we hope you can grow and use for any size of site, whether it's a landing page or an enterprise site. It is a solid foundation to scale upon for really any design system. Thank you so much for the time. We'll see you next time.